Okay.
Ready? Okay. Well, thanks for coming along, everybody, and the people on the blog will watch this later. We're going to hear a paper by Matheus Grasselli about extending, of all things, the Keen-Minsky Model, my model of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. And the way this has come about is a complicated story, which I might actually for once tell Matheus' story, and you can correct me when I get it wrong. And that is that Matheus is Professor of Mathematics at McMaster University, and some time ago decided he would like to become a director at the Fields Institute, which is the one of the globe's leading mathematical research centres, applied mathematics, a whole range of areas. And as part of that, he put together a colloquium on financial economics, mathematical finance and economics, which was held in 2010, having started the planning back in about 2005.
Something like that, yeah.
And a little thing intervened called the global financial crisis, and you would have thought the people there would have some idea of what the hell happened, and only one of them did. And his recommendation was to Matheus to, if you want to actually understand cycles, read Kindleberger. So he then got out Kindle. Which Kindleberger did you get?
Manias, Panics, and
Crashes, yeah. And of course, the opening chapter of that talks about Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. So Matheus' reaction was, oh, this is, really good explanation, makes a lot of sense. It's clearly a mainstream thing because, Kindleberger's got a mainstream name. So there must be lots of mathematical models out there. I'll go and take a look at, which ones I like and then work on them. And you didn't only find one, did you?
Mm.
You did only find...
I think it's just one, yeah.
Yeah. There are several others that have been done before I did my model back in '95, but they all stuck to 2 dimensions. And economists might not know why that matters, but mathematicians do. The mine was 3 and 4 dimensional, and now Matheus is extending it dramatically. And as far as I'm concerned, having a mathematician like Matheus take up what I've been doing is manna from heaven. So happy to you, mate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. And what Steve didn't say is that he just spent a month in Canada where we were having tremendous fun working on all these things. And then he extended the invitation that I could come here and talk to you. Of course, it's it's an interesting thing to talk about the Keen model here. It's about, I suppose it's just like going to the Sistine Chapel and give a talk on, recent advances in fresco technique. But I'll try and see if I have things to add to the model. So the first question is why should we have yet another talk on financial crisis? After all, it was some time ago, and people have moved on and should be doing research on other things, shouldn't they? Well, really, they shouldn't. I mean, as Kindleberger says in his book, they are a hardy perennial. They tend to come back. And even if you think that you understood and you took measures to prevent and so on, they reoccur. And so my second reason is a bit more cynical, is that, is that macroeconomics is too important to be left to macroeconomists. So when I, as Steve mentioned, started looking at these models, it was a little bit of a revelation that the dominant view in macroeconomics more or less ignores crisis and assumes that crises don't exist, as we're going to discuss in a bit. This is something that needs to be conquered. Cato would finish all his speeches in the Roman Senate by saying that, Carthage must be destroyed. Regardless what the topic was, he could be talking about roads and sanitation, and he would finish with that. So here's the same. Yeah. No problem. So what I mentioned as the dominant view in macroeconomics, most of you in the audience are familiar with, is what goes under the name of dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. They are overwhelmingly dominant. I don't know, more than 90% of programs in the US only teach stuff with DSGE views. They proudly announced all the statements I'm going to make here. I'm not making them up, and in fact, I didn't get them from critics of DSGs. They come from, a preface of a standard, well-established book on DSG, where they point out the following features of the theory as strong points. That you seek to aggregate seek to explain aggregate variables using things that have strong micro foundations, and by that it's meant rationality of individual agents. All variables are assumed to be in equilibrium at all times. I put assumed in red because it is really an assumption. You would think that you can then prove that if it's out of equilibrium, it will come back to equilibrium. There is some sort of stability result, but very deep negative results proved by mathematical economists under the name of the Sonnenschein, Mantel-Debreu theorems showed that this is actually not possible to establish stability of the equilibrium. So you need to assume it's something that cannot be really guaranteed. The only way that the economy is not in equilibrium is when you have disinformation shocks. So somebody doesn't understand something that is going on. There's a new technology. The iPad comes along. People still don't know what are the possible uses. But as soon as information is revealed, then everybody needs to go back to converge to the path of another equilibrium. Might not be the same equilibrium, but it will go back. And this is, it starts as most of the statements made in DSG or other neoclassical schools of economics. It starts with a very sort of benign observation that people don't make repeated mistakes. People shouldn't, continue making mistakes once the information is revealed. But then it's a tremendously big step to say that this will automatically lead to stabilizing and getting the path back to equilibrium. Money is neutral in terms of actual production and consumption decisions. Money only affects the price level. So if you really think that money is neutral, I have a bridge to sell it, and maybe with neutral money.
Somebody else this morning at Bloomberg. It's all right.
Yeah. And the effects of uncertainty are really neglected to an extent, because it's the type of, this is irreducible uncertainty that I point out there, the type of uncertainty where you can't really, what Keynes would say is uncertainty that cannot be tamed by statistics. In all these models, uncertainty is very well behaved, and once you have distributions and expected values and so on, you just replace all the variables by the expected values, subtract things from the risk factor, and everything works as if it was morally deterministic. There is uncertainty, but it has the flavor of a deterministic theory. Now, there, as you all know, if you follow debates in the blogosphere, there's famous ways of characterizing different schools in DSG. There's the hardcore advocates, so that goes under the name of freshwater, because they were associated with schools that had lakes around it. Chicago comes to mind, but also Minneapolis. The first time I gave this talk was in Minneapolis. I thought that at this point I would get, tomatoes flying from the audience. But what do you know? It was in the math department. The economists didn't bother to show up, so I was saved. And they made the following predictions concerning the crisis. So they go under the name of real business cycles. And one thing was that government spending, borrowing to finance spending, would send interest rates way up because of the loanable funds theory. So they would be crowding out private investment. An increase in the money supply would generate inflation. And in an ideal world, fiscal stimulus has no effect, because whenever the government spends, people automatically realize that they need to pay taxes later on, so they stop spending themselves. They start saving for taxes. That's Ricardian equivalence. And this is ideally, but the world is not ideal, so they would say that it's even worse in reality, because government has wasteful spending. So government spending not only has no effects in stimulation, but it actually can depress the economy because of the perception of wasteful waste of resources. And you see, the opposite of that is what people try to argue when they talk about austerity, because then in an ideal world, stopping government spending also has no effect, but because the world is not ideal and people would regain confidence if they see the government contracting, then they would spend more than just Ricardian equivalence would indicate. Well, let's see how they worked in practice. Not that well. This is what happened for the first prediction, that interest rates would go up with government spending. So in one line, in the red line, you see government spending since 2008, and this is what happens to interest rates. So not quite the crowding out effect. Inflation, the same thing. So you see here an increase in the money supply, increased by 4 or 5 times or whatever, and this is the rate of inflation. So also not quite accurate prediction. And the third one about reverse Ricardian equivalence, well, this is a graph of, this is fiscal tightening, so contraction in government spending, and this is what happens to GDP. So what do you know? Contractionary policies are contractionary. You stop spending and the economy shrinks. Who would have thought? Not freshwater economists, clearly. Now, there's, and I like this graph because it shows that, this compares from the beginning of both the Great Depression and now, what happened to GDP in England, and it shows that England has the distinct prize of doing worse than the Great Depression. Now, you need to work very hard to do something that was worse than when people knew very little about macroeconomics as a whole. But Britain is on the path of doing that, achieving that. Now, a separate strand would be what's called saltwater DSG.
Definition of soft core. That's quite cute.
That's right. Yeah, soft core. That's right. Yeah, the soft core DSG. It's still DSG at its core. Has still all the same fundamental principles of actual investment, production, consumption, and everything else that goes on in the economy. They are not just intermediaries that move money around. They're not just ATM machines that you go and withdraw and spend. So, uncertainty in the valuation of cash flows and liabilities. So it's an interplay of commitments that you made in the past, and you need to see if you still have cash flows to pay for those commitments. And if you do, you validate the debt, and then you enter more debt. And if you don't, it means that the decisions were incorrect, and you have to reduce the level of debt. So as Minsky would say, in an economy with past, the economy is fundamentally cyclical, with each state, boom, crisis, deflation, stagnation, expansion, containing the elements that lead to the other phase. And this is important, in an identifiable manner. It's not a certain thing, but it's identifiable. You can identify the elements and you can move through the cycles in that way. And so when I read that, I thought, well, this is perfect for modeling in a differential equation point of view, because that's exactly what happens in dynamical systems. They move from stage to stage, and you kind of know where you are in the cycle as you're moving along. So the goal of the models is, and I realize I should be going faster. Where's my, well, anyways, I'll try to speed up. The goal is to model this financial instability hypothesis. So let me tell you in words what the financial instability hypothesis is, and then we see what the mathematics is. So you start suppose that you are in a period where firms are very conservative in their borrowing, and banks are very conservative in their lending, for example, because it just came out of a severe financial crisis. That means that the only things that people borrow for is just to bridge some shortfall in cash flow. So you don't borrow to do very daring projects. You have an expectation of what cash flows are going to be. You don't have enough, and then you borrow for that. So it's very easy to pay that back. You know, it's very easy to validate that debt, so existing debt is easily validated. Well, because it's easy to validate, then you look foolish not to have more debt. So you should leverage. You should increase that debt gradually because, you know, there's a handsome payout for increasing the level of debt. So slowly there is a reevaluation of the probability that debt is going to be repaid, and then people borrow more, and because they're borrowing more, they're buying more, and that increases the demand for assets, and then the prices go up, and what they are doing is then selling those assets to other people who will then borrow money to buy them. So everything gets easily justified. It's the expansion. So this is the euphoric phase. There's more debt to equity ratio, and there is where this phenomenon of a Ponzi financier appears. So what is a Ponzi financier? Is a financial unit that doesn't have enough money to pay just from the cash flows that they're obtaining to pay the interest on their debt, but that doesn't matter because they just borrow more and buy more assets in the expectation that when they have to sell the assets, the prices are going to be so high that it's going to pay all the debt. So think of you know, the mortgage market in the US, where you just do this sort of zero down payment mortgages, and you really don't have money to pay continuously all the interest service on the mortgage, but that doesn't matter because you just remortgage at a higher price because the property prices are going up. So that's what Ponzi financiers do. But this cannot go forever. Eventually, there's going to be a little shock, a little disturbance to the system that can take the form of any kind of a small piece of bad news. So this is the key point. When you are at this stage, now everything is over-leveraged. The system is in a critical point that makes low impact, high probability events. So these are things that, you know, they happen every day and they have a very low impact, and they wouldn't matter if you were not in this kind of criticality. So what leads now to the unraveling of the entire story is not a low probability, high impact. It's not a black swan. It's not something that was completely out of the blue. It's any combination of small fluctuations that then just propagate through the system. So the Ponzi financiers have to sell their assets. Everybody's trying to sell at the same time. Liquidity is very hard to find, and the euphoria becomes a panic. As somebody says, it's not the speed that kills you, it's the sudden stop. It's the Wile E. Coyote moment in the cartoon. Right? You're running, and then you keep running until you realize, and then you fall. So as Minsky would say, stability or tranquility in a world with cyclical past and capitalist financial institutions is destabilizing. It was stability itself that led to this sort of over-leveraged state. So it's not some external shock. It's not something that you know, the system left by itself is going to be permanently in equilibrium, and then only when it's shocked from whatever, Martians, it's going to come out of the equilibrium. No, it's endogenous. The instability arises endogenously. Okay, well, that's all very well. Now, how can we do that mathematically? Well, that's where the fun starts. So there's this model by Richard Goodwin in the 60s, and that's really the basis. What Steve said was a two-dimensional model that he then generalized. So let's try to just understand the notation and the basics for it. So N is the total labor force, and it's assumed to be increasing exponentially. All this can be relaxed. You could have sort of a logistic curve for the labor force or what have you. Productivity also, just for simplicity, grows exponentially over time, and this is just Y. So Y is the total output. It's just the product of the productivity per worker and how many people are employed. So L is the fraction of the labor force that is actually employed. Very well, and it relates to the total amount of capital through a capital to output ratio, nu. Now, so this is just definitions. There's no assumption here. The first assumptions in the model are these two. So they're behavioral assumptions for the agents in the model. But they are not behavioral assumptions for the individual agents. They are behavioral in the aggregate. So one is that workers will negotiate a higher salary depending on the rate of employment. So if the employment is high, the rate of change of wages is going to be high. And what determines it is a Phillips curve that is just assumed to be an increase in function of employment. And the other one, so this we're going to keep until the end of the talk. Well, we're not going to replace by anything else. Now this one is going to be dropped, but at this point what it says is that K dot, so, oh, by the way, dots are just derivatives in time. So K dot is the change in capital, so that just means that to increase capital, you reinvest. What do you reinvest? You reinvest all your profits. So Y is the output. Once you pay labor, that's profit, and you don't do anything else with it but reinvest. And this is just depreciation. So this is just, you know, saying that all profits, all wages are consumed, all profits are reinvested. Okay, now you just manipulate the variables a little bit, define the wage share, so that's the proportion of the output that is paid in wages, and that's the employment rate, so just a fraction of the population that is employed, and this become the two dynamic variables of the theory, and they follow this system of differential equations, which is formally identical to a predator-prey system. Now, this is the dynamics for it. It just moves in a cycle as with employment and wages. So you see when at one point both employment and wages are going up, and then eventually wages are too high that it's not profitable for the capitalist, so he needs to lay off workers, and then employment goes down, and then people start taking wage cuts when employment is too low, and then it's profitable again for the capitalist starts hiring, and then you go up, and then it just keeps going like that. So this is, you know, very simple two-dimensional theory of endogenous cycles. This is the time evolution. Oops, damn it. Yes, so that was the phase space. Now this is how it moves in time. So that's time down here, and then both lambda and y. Y here is the output, and then lambda and omega are just fluctuations. So there's these fluctuations, and then the economy just grows in time, but oscillating. Okay, so it is completely simple. You couldn't make it simpler than that, and already encapsulates a lot. Already picks up an awful lot of what the cyclicity of the model is. But of course, the world is not that simple, so we need to expand it a little bit. And the first extension is what Steve did in his in the article that preceded his PhD thesis, and now I'm just reading the PhD thesis. And it's really, you know, a fundamental insight in the model. That remember in Say's law that, you know, you're going to invest all your profits. Here, you don't need to invest just your profits. You can get beyond. You can invest more than your profits. And you invest more than your profits by borrowing. And you borrow it from a financial system that does more than intermediate between savers and spenders. You know, the financial system actually creates spending power. So that's, you know, Schumpeter, Minsky, and then formalized in this way. It's not the case that people decide to spend less, and then those people that are spending less, the banks channel the money to the people who are going to be investing. This is a net increase in the availability of funds to be invested, and it's given by just this function. So now the change in capital, instead of being just profits, is a superlinear function of profits. It means that when profits are high, you're going to borrow more, you're going to invest more than your profits, so the difference needs to be borrowed. So kappa is just an increase in function, has the same shape as the Phillips curve. If it was linear, if it was just, in fact, more than linear, if it was the identity function, then this would reduce us to the previous model, okay, where you're just investing exactly what you have in profit. The point here is that you can invest more than your profits when profits are high, and when profits are low, you also invest differently. You divest, you take away from the profits to pay debt. That's the important thing. So it works symmetrically as well, right? When times are good, you invest more than what you're making. When times are bad, you invest less than what you're making. You take away from investment to pay down debt. Very well. Now the output is a slightly more complicated equation. and debt evolves according to this, you notice if this was the identity function, that would cancel, and debt would remain constant. But it doesn't. It can go up or it can go down. So now it's a three-dimensional system. The first two replace what we had before for the predator-prey model, but now there's a third equation. And this third variable is what makes the system more interesting, is what can create all sorts of different regimes. So now this is what we're going to analyze for the next little while, and then this is mostly what Steve did, but then we're going to do a couple more extensions. So first of all, you look at an equation like this, and you want to know what the equilibrium points are. Now, an equilibrium is a point where, you know, the right-hand side is going to be 0, because then the ratio of changes are all going to be 0. So it's a stationary point. So you want to make the right-hand side 0. There are two ways of doing that. One is what we have been calling the good equilibrium. You just go back to the equations and see what's the lambda that makes this 0, what's the omega and pi that makes this 0, and then you put it there, and it's given by this. So it's just, you know, an algebraic equation of the parameters of the model. So 1 from now on is going to denote this, the good equilibrium. All right? And you notice at the good equilibrium, there's a finite level of debt. Debt stabilizes at a finite level. And then the growth of the economy, you substitute the wage share and debt at equilibrium, and you get that the economy grows at alpha plus beta, which is the sum of the productivity increase and population increase. So sure, it will fluctuate, but on average, it grows just as something that is growing at that rate. Sorry, alpha is constant? Yeah, and beta is constant.
That means you're saying that growth will be constant.
That's correct, at equilibrium. But you need to see how you approach equilibrium, and if you ever stay at equilibrium. You want to see if this equilibrium is stable or not. So yes, if you are at equilibrium, then growth is constant.
But if you go back to the distribution, then again come to the equilibrium. So
I never said that. This is what DSGE people would say. An equilibrium is just, here, the definition, an equilibrium is just a point where all this is 0. But now what happens if you move a little bit away from equilibrium, if you just keep moving away or go back, depend on the shape of the, what these functions are around equilibrium. So that has never been assumed that you will go back to equilibrium. But it's a good point. And the rest of, you know, many of the extensions are what happens. Can we stabilize or destabilize equilibrium in this way? Very well.
So you basically assume stable equilibrium.
I never assumed that.
No, I'm saying that. Wilson says he's a mathematician as well. So.
If you do assume stable equilibrium, then money is neutral. Because growth is just a function of the real variable.
Yeah, that's all right. Yes. Yeah. But what we're going to see is that, you know, this equilibrium is actually locally stable, but it's not globally stable. It means that you could start at points and then not go to it, go somewhere else. And this somewhere else that you go.
In that case, you have to actually do two equilibrium. One is a global equilibrium, one is local equilibrium.
No. I have different equilibria, and some of them are locally stable, some of them are globally stable. So being locally stable just means that if you start sufficiently near it, then you're going to converge to it. Being globally stable means that it doesn't matter where you start, you're going to converge to it. And in fact, we don't have any, we couldn't find any globally stable equilibrium. All the equilibriums I'm going to be talking about are locally stable, which means that if you are removed from it, you can go somewhere else. You don't necessarily need to go back to it. So okay, that's all very good points. So this was the good equilibrium. Now what's the bad equilibrium? So there are a couple of other equilibria that are very, I mean, they are not that important because they are what is called structurally unstable. If you change the parameters, they disappear. So I'm only concentrating on things that are stable under a small perturbation of the parameters themselves. So that's what happens. And then I want to see if they are dynamically stable or not. So things that are structurally unstable are just throw in the garbage anyways. But anyway, so you concentrate on this too. There's a good one and there's a bad one. What is the bad equilibrium? Well, it's, so to see it, the best way is to change the variable. Instead of debt, you look at 1 over debt. Okay? So that's just a simple change of variable. But that illuminates things because now the third equation, in terms of u, you see that it has an equilibrium when u equals 0. Whereas in the original system, d equals 0 was not an equilibrium because of this autonomous term here. But if you do 1 over that, then the system becomes entirely homogeneous, so u equals 0 is an equilibrium. Now what is u equals 0 is when that is infinity. So now all of a sudden you have a situation where the possibility of having, yes?
You got r over u on the second equation.
Where?
How could you put u equals 0?
Because it's inside kappa.
No, the second equation.
Here, or here. In both of them, yeah. No, this is the technical point. Kappa is a function that decreases sufficiently fast at minus infinity that this just goes to 0.
That becomes 0.
Yeah.
That function is 0. Right.
Okay, so that's the point. Yeah, this grows, but at kappa at minus infinity is not. It doesn't actually need to be 0. It just needs to be a constant. So yeah, so that was one of the technical, and it's a very natural technical condition. It just says that when your profits are very negative, you just stand. You don't invest or divest. You sort of stay on the sidelines.
Can I ask one question? If you say D is the debt as a percentage of GDP or whatever.
Yes.
Okay. Now when D will constantly increase.
Yeah, it could be higher than the total output.
Say
Yeah.
If it is increased constantly, it may not be infinite. Or even if it may be finite, that U actually tends to infinity. Because it's won by a very large quantity.
It goes to 0. U goes to 0.
Goes to 0.
That's correct.
If U goes to 0,
Yeah.
then R by U goes to infinity.
But that's what I just said. Goes to minus infinity. So if you plot, does that plot things?
Yeah.
Or is it one? So what you're doing is, it's like this. This is the function kappa, and kappa depends on profit. Now profit is 1 minus omega minus r over u. So what you want is to know what happens when profit goes to minus infinity, and it has an asymptote here. That's the point. So kappa at minus infinity is what we're going to call kappa 0 later in the model, is an asymptote. This doesn't go to minus infinity, and it doesn't go to plus infinity. Kappa is assumed to have this shape.
Yeah.
Okay? And we make it also the derivatives of kappa to be sufficiently fast decreasing, that because we're going to have to take derivatives here eventually, and it all works out well with this term. So that's one of, that's why we write in this way, so that all the conditions are explicit. So you write in terms of u, because then you see everything working. Very well. So now what you see is that 0, 0, 0 is an equilibrium, but 0, 0, 0 corresponds to 0 wages, 0 employment, and infinite debt. Okay? The interesting thing is that this is not an unstable, because if it was unstable, you could say, oh, we never reach it. We are going to be, somebody's going to do something before you get to it, and then we're going to move away. But no, it's locally stable. So now you have 2 locally stable. So the picture I like, think this is your 3-dimensional system. Here's a good equilibrium. It has some basin of attraction around it that you go to it. But if you're sufficiently far from it, you just go to the boundary. And the boundary is at d equals to infinity. And both of them are locally stable, because if you now start sufficiently close to that boundary, you're going to converge to that. So it's a situation that the moral is that you cannot ignore it. You cannot just brush aside the bad equilibrium. And you do that by looking at the Jacobian of the system, so I'm going to spare you these details. But the point is that the stability of the bad equilibrium is very easy to achieve. The only condition is that kappa 0, which is that constant there, over nu minus delta needs to be less than r. Now kappa 0 is going to be typically negative, delta is positive, this is going to be typically less than r, even for real interest rates that can be negative. So this, it's a very easy condition to satisfy. So the moral is, again, you cannot dismiss the bad equilibrium. Well, if you cannot dismiss, then you've got to do something with it, and that's what the rest of the talk is. But before we just go to that, let's just see a couple of examples. So this is what happens for the good equilibrium. You go moving around, and then eventually it converges. So you see fluctuations, right? While it's fluctuating, the rate of increase in the economy is not constant. It's variable, because you're not at equilibrium yet. And then eventually it just goes to equilibrium.
So let me see, you believe there will be equilibrium exists at certain point of time.
That's correct.
When you don't know.
Oh, well, I can actually, you know, given the parameters, we can calculate how long it takes to achieve the equilibrium. But of course, you know, the parameters are only estimates, so yes, in practice you don't know, but you know, this one took 200 years to get to equilibrium for typical parameters that we chose.
Might be the other, like LIBOR interest rate manipulation, something will come up on that
and shift it out. That's fine. Yeah.
It's never happened.
That's fine. But the point here is that it's a controllable situation. You're having the cycles, but you're not exploding to other places. Now, the very different, so this is what happens at the good equilibrium. You know, things fluctuate and eventually go to a constant level, including a constant level of debt, and the economy just increases. So this is, you know, paradise, okay? But that's not the only thing that can happen. You can have this. Come on. You can have this, where you start moving around and you think that you're just oscillating as before, but notice that the level of debt now is increasing, and then something sinister happens when it's sufficiently high, and then you stop just moving around. It just goes and doesn't come back. No, okay, it's just that I didn't continue the picture. I'll show you another. So this is what happens. You know, it fluctuates, and then the economy seems to be doing well. It goes increasing, increasing, increasing. But then at one point, debt is just too much, and then everything goes down. And then debt goes to infinity.
I like the sound effects.
Yes, that's because I have a boy as a son, and you know, as my friend says, boys, they come with a gene. You know. Girls, they don't. You know, it must be frustration. Yeah. So this is now again a different picture, but now I did it in terms of 1 over d, because now you can see very clearly what's going on. You know, it then just moves around to. And I call that, what is it, Zuccotti Park? Where they had, yes, that's where you end up. Right?
So what is the practical, what do you mean by that? End up at 0, 0, 0. What do you mean by that?
It means that at that point, your economy crashed. You have 0 wages, 0 employment, and infinite debt. So yes, it went.
It's like a black hole.
Yeah, but but it's all mathematically sounds very nice.
Yeah, so of course now, yes, this is exactly the point. You would never get to that. Something else will happen before that, right? But what will happen before that? The point here is that we want to have policies that will prevent from getting there. You don't want to have a situation where you need to take up the streets in, you know, Dark Knight Rises type of thing to prevent that. You want to do it in a rational government intervention kind of thing. And all that this is saying is that without any kind of policy, if you just rely on the dynamics of the system itself, that's where. But it's very difficult to imagine a situation where you end up with everybody unemployed and making 0 money. Something is going to give before you get to that. The point is what? You know, how do you prevent that? Do you prevent that by, you know, a well-defined and well-thought-out policy, or you just let it go and then wait for the next catastrophe to happen?
Walking in goose steps to march and then change it.
Exactly, right, okay? So something will move you out of that trajectory. But this is a way of understanding how you could do that, you know, with a little bit of planning. So this is another view. Now, just what happens before you reach the really growing debt. And I put this here to emphasize 2 points. One is what happens with debt. So you see debt is increasing, and then people deleverage, but they don't quite go back to what it was before. They start a little bit higher than what it was before. And now here I also plotted the picture that we saw in the beginning, the change in debt and how it correlates with employment. Okay, so that empirical observation is perfectly supported by the model. And this is the level of private debt in many countries, Australia, Canada, UK, and the US. And you should see the pattern there was in this picture, increasing and then decreasing, but not going back to where it was. Okay? So there's a 3-dimensional, dead simple, entirely analytic model that already captures a lot of what's going on in the dynamic of debt. There is no DSG model that does that. I challenge anybody to come up with a model that has a span of 40 years and captures this level of the dynamics of what's going on. They are going to be recalibrating it every so often, and then recalibrate. This is with a fixed parameter range. The SGE models would do it every 5 years, find completely different parameters. Right? So it's a very different way of tackling this. Okay? And this is the Basin of Convergence. That just says that, you know, if you start in this region, you're going to converge to the good equilibrium. If you start outside this region, it's not guaranteed that you converge to the bad equilibrium, but it means that you will not converge to the good equilibrium. Okay? And you notice that as that increases, the Basin of Convergence shrinks. So the higher the initial level of that, the harder it is to go back to the good equilibrium. Okay, so that was the model. The basic model. Now let's try to add other features to it. Yes?
Before you do that, for those of us who are good with the maths, don't actually speak and we look at it, what is actually going on in the bank? What is the intuition? What is the story? Why,
well, the story is that, you know, it, in the equation, every time you try, let's see, the original system, here, you know, every time, because your profits depend on the level of debt, because you need to service this debt. And then the thing is now, whenever there is a downturn, you're going to think that you can just lay off employees a little bit and wait for the profits to come back, but the debt is already at a high level, and then it doesn't come back that quickly. And then when you start again, you start by borrowing more. The only way to pick up again is by borrowing. So you just deleverage enough so that this turns into a positive thing and you start borrowing.
Yeah.
In this model, the private debt is debt of corporations and firms.
That's
not
correct.
of the consumer sector.
That's correct. No, there's no, yes, this is an extension that can be done, but this is entirely concentrated in the,
But one of the striking things of the last few years in the United States is the profits are not low. Firms are holding cash and they're simply not investing.
This is the recent situation, is they're not investing because they don't find enough demand to invest, and there is no incentive for them to invest. They just prefer to.
Well, another argument is about uncertainty.
That's correct. Yeah, I mean that's the same argument. There's no incentive because there is no demand, and then there's uncertain demand. So why would you, you know, make a significant investment if you don't know that people are going to be buying your stuff? Okay. Now.
That's growing because these businesses are making losses.
Well, what you just go back to that equation again, Matthias, and the debt equation, you notice the rate of change of debt. One factor in there is interest rate times the current level of debt.
Yes.
So if you get such a level of debt, you've got an exponentially increasing process which can only be reduced if the level of profit is high enough to do so, and with a massive level of debt, it can't be high enough. You therefore have the simple compounding of debt. What the model doesn't include is bankruptcy.
Yes, that was exactly what I was going to say.
Okay, if you have bankruptcy, then you can ultimately reduce that debt because you're actually abolishing it.
Yeah, it
the
would be.
analogy I gave in one talk was it's a bit like Hawkins radiation for a black hole. You know, that's actually happening, spinning black hole, and you lose the mass and it detracts, and therefore the attracting power of a black hole diminishes. We're saying unless you have that, then you continue collapsing into a black hole of debt. And then once you also, the trouble is once you get in this region, which we are arguably there now, then as long as we try to resist reducing the debt, we're going to be pulled back into it again. So it's got, even though it has the unrealistic thing of no bankruptcy, the model, what happens is we try to not dishonour debt that is excessive to the system.
Now, I have a question to you. When should I stop? Because that will tell me how fast I should talk.
Wrong as a timekeeper.
Probably about 5 minutes after the hour.
Okay, yeah. So I will speed up towards the end, but I want to concentrate more on this stabilizing government section. So this is something that Steve did in one way in his original papers, then we did differently, and now we are doing combined. We had a conversation on Monday or Tuesday where we decided to combine the two views, and it's one of those fortunate circumstances that the good features of the separate models come together and the bad features go away. So it's kind of, right? That's what you want. Now, let me just explain what the idea is that now, so the whole model didn't have a government. Now you put a government, what can the government do? Well, the government can do two things. When profits are going low and the private sector will deleverage and therefore lay out employees and so on, the government steps in and spends. Well, that's stimulus spending. So that prevents the downturn. I mean, it attenuates the downturn a little bit. The other thing that the government can do is to tax when you are in the upswing of things and then sort of take away the incentive for this over-borrowing. Now, that actually never happens. So we don't put that much in the model. In the model, the level of taxation is barely there to pay out the government debt. So we don't use aggressive taxation in the sense of, you know, you go to the banks or the corporations and say, you are making too much profit. Now your marginal tax rate goes to 90%. We don't have that there. You know, maybe Monsieur Hollande is going to be able to do that in France, but we don't consider that realistic. But the government spending is. So the government spending is something that many countries do try. Now, the point here is that we break out government spending into two components. The one component and the two component. The one component is something that its differential equation depends on the level of output. So if you like, this is sort of the things moving along in a normal state. And this is what we call then either base government spending or non-discretionary government spending. So this is the bulk of the government spending. It's the stuff that you would spend anyways in just health care or military or roads and so on. So that's the stuff that it's always there. Now this other component here, notice if you're familiar with ODEs, the point here is that it's proportional to itself. So once it's zero, it remains zero. So it's a perturbation of the system. It's something that you only add if you want to achieve something with it. But it's strictly a perturbation of zero. This one is not a perturbation around zero. This one remains there always. Okay? So this is the non-discretionary government spending, and this is purely discretionary. So it's some component that you switch on when you want to have the effect of stabilizing the way I said. So
then why are you saying that this is a G2, the prime is a function of G2? How can
it's a rate of change.
The rate of change is, yeah.
But why is this a function of G2? Because you are saying that this does not depend on anything.
That's correct. Yeah, but no, it depends. It depends. Sorry. It depends on lambda and depends on pi. The actual rate of change will be what the level is times this factor, which is a decrease in function of lambda. So if employment is very high, this is going to be small and you don't bother. If employment is low, so eta has this shape. And it's actually going to be very important what this number is, eta max. So it's the highest level of spending when this is lambda. So when the employment is coming down to zero, you want to prop up this spending. The spending goes up. Okay? So it's not that it depends only on itself and nothing else. It depends on the entire system, but it has the functional form that it's a perturbation of zero. So you can add it in. So in the equilibrium for this, if you like, is G2 and T2 equals to 0. At the good equilibrium, that wouldn't be there.
Yeah, it's a discretionary policy, but it can actually be either way. We could actually model austerity with this, as well as modeling, the right stimulus.
Yes, because austerity would be on this component here, where you now pull it back precisely when it's necessary. So austerity doesn't come in here because this is always a positive function. But here you can actually decrease the level of spending when you are in a depression, right? And then see how perverse that would be. But anyway, so the point here is that now your profits depend on what the government is spending and taxing as well, as we said. And now you need to keep track of government debt altogether. Okay, then what happens here? So there's a story to tell here, so through several examples. So in my first example, I have government spending equal to 0 and taxation equal to 0. That's the discretionary one, okay? So that just says without government intervention, what would happen to this system? And that's the case that we saw before, oscillates and then crashes to zero, and that goes to infinity, right? So start with initial conditions that are sufficiently close to this bad equilibrium. So that means, you know, low wage share, low employment, and high debt. Those are bad initial conditions. And this eta max is kind of low as well, but we'll talk about that in a second. So this is what happens. Now you turn government on. So I'm going to change this to something that is non-zero. So 0.1, okay? It's like 10% of GDP, stimulus of the size of 10% of GDP. And then what happens that for the same initial conditions that you had before, it doesn't crash anymore. Debt goes to a moderate level, and employment and wage share is stabilized at a finite value. It doesn't go to zero. So this was an effective stimulus. It effectively brought you back from the bad infinite debt equilibrium. But that, you know, so then add government and drive it back to the good equilibrium. But it could still crash if you make the initial conditions bad. So the initial conditions here was 0.75 wage share and 0.8 employment. Make that 0.3 employment, so, you know, 70% unemployment, and, well, gee, yeah, it still crashes. That still goes to infinity. Why? Because the reaction function here, the eta max, is not aggressive enough. Now, if you make the government spending really aggressive, so your eta max here is 0.5, this means that the rate of change in government spending at zero employment can be as high as, you know, you put half of the goddamn GDP into stimulus. You're going to be building roads and ports and a project to go to the moon if Newt Gingrich was elected. And okay?
As long as he actually catches the same thing, it's a good idea.
Yeah, but one of the things which I didn't understand, that your eta max,
yes,
which is varies, you said 0.01, then you are saying 0.5.
Yes.
So that is actually varies actually used range. And when that will actually happen, what? We never know that thing.
Oh, that's right. But this is the part, I mean, that's the point of being discretionary. This is the thing that you choose. As a government, you can choose what your reaction is going to be. If your reaction is going to be, for example, Europe entered a agreement between nations that they're going to have no reaction, that they're going to have balanced budgets forever. They're never going to go up to more than whatever 3% of GDP in deficit. That's their eta max. They're effectively saying what their eta max is. Whereas you could, by, you know, an act of Congress, go up and say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this much of stimulus. So the fact that eta max varies is actually reflective of the fact that policies do vary.
Variation is too much. We never know actually what is the equilibrium, what is the good equilibrium, what is the bad equilibrium. Nothing is known.
Of course nothing is known. What I'm showing you is the range of possibilities. So here, I'm just saying, the point is that this is what's most likely to happen. An unemployment of 20% is a pretty bad situation. All that I'm saying is that this is sufficiently flexible that even with 70% unemployment, the government can still bring it back, provided the reaction is not small, provided the reaction is sufficiently large. So I'm just giving you the sort of extreme scenarios that can be accommodated by the theory. And of course, where you actually is depends on, you know, you look at the variables and so on, and then you're going to say what is the realistic range for this virus. There has never been a government that in just one act of Congress decided to spend 50% of their GDP. So you say, okay, this is not that realistic, but neither is 70% unemployment. So now you adjust to what the data you have. Yes?
The model is saying it turns profits. Now you put a G minus T. The last you have there?
Yes.
Yeah. G minus T. I think that the feeling among a lot of people, especially in the US, is that is kind of not realistic assumption.
Well, how do you mean? I mean, government spends and needs to go somewhere. So that the government spending adds to profits directly. That's something that even Minsky was already given tables about it.
These expenditures have got to be paid for, and what are the expenditures on? Now, the red stimulus is mentioned, but you have the Obama stimulus, where most of this money went to people employed by public sector unions, working for state and local governments.
Well, but the point is that, well, the idea is that it doesn't go directly into public works, but you pay salaries of teachers that eventually need to go in.
It didn't go into public works, and the predictions were at the time that was made that we'd have had recovery summer. That's 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I forget what.
Yeah.
But unemployment didn't peak at 8% and then be at 6%.
Look, that's because of a small eta max. I mean, even our friend Paul Krugman was saying that at the time. I mean, you do a back-of-envelope calculation of how much the stimulus ought to be, just to put you back in the kind of same ballpark of output, capacity output, and it was, a quarter of what it ought to be. So that's one situation where, the reaction was deliberately too small.
Let's come back to what you just said about the money's got to go somewhere in terms of G minus T.
Yeah.
Explain to me why it is that if government spending goes up by 800 billion, profits will rise by 800 billion. That doesn't follow at all.
Well, the government's spending money into the economy. It's also an exogenous, external to the market economy source of monetary demand. If the government pumps that much money in, unless it taxes the money out, that much more cash is there to be earned. Now, you've got to look at the turnover of that money and so on. And this is all continuous time modelling.
I think that's quite a stretch to get.
Well, we've actually done the mathematics on that as well, which is a separate paper. But it does turn up as an increase in aggregate demand, whether it comes from the private sector borrowing.
No, profit.
Yeah.
That's profit, G minus T.
Yeah.
What
we've got is all the spending, all government spending in this model. It's simplistic, but all the government spending in this model is spent on the firm sector. We don't have the government spending on itself. Now, you could generalise it to say where the government pays wages, which then turn up in the income of people working in the government who spend a portion of what they earn, and that therefore ends up in the firm sector. This is a
if you like, this is net. Yeah, this is the.
What it's doing is buying what firms produce.
The government spends, $100 there, profit will rise by $100.
Yeah, but what you said is that some of the spending was spent on the government sector itself. But so what I need to put here is the net government spending. It's, this is, to quote from what these people talk all the time in the blogs, this is just an accounting identity. Once you net out what the government is spending on itself, the remainder, by definition, need to go to the private sector, because there are only two sectors: there's the government and the private.
which is the firm entirely, just firm.
True. Because in this model, the private sector consists only of firms.
Can I just intervene? I mean, this is the result of a multiplied process working itself out, and firms, households don't save, and all saving is done by firms. So
within the
by
context
the
of
time
this
it's
model,
worked itself through, any injection has to.
It's also Koleski's profit equation. The same thing with Koleski's logic.
So do you think it will work with
I think let's debate this model rather than Koleski. We're actually debating the relevance of Koleski's profit equation. I think it's distracting us a bit.
So the last thing I want to say about the government spending is this. So this was all about the discretionary one. Now in the non-discretionary one, and that's what we did in the past few days with my collaborators in Canada, they sent me this picture, which is a bifurcation diagram for the level of eta max. So what they're showing here is that this is the good equilibrium there, and for sufficiently high eta max, the good equilibrium is stable and is the only thing that shows up. Now, for an eta max of moderate proportions, what you see here is the emergence of a limit cycle, which was something that wasn't in the model before at all. So with government intervention of small magnitude, what you then see is, as well as the good equilibrium, you have this added limit cycles, which is something that you can actually argue that it's what happened. And you're not stabilizing it to the really good equilibrium, you're just seeing now the emergence of an extra cycle in the model. And of course, you see that the amplitude of the cycle gets very high. What happens is that when this decreases sufficiently, then the cycle breaks down and then you go to the bad equilibrium. You go to the infinite dash. So this is as complete a picture as you get. And we didn't have that before with the non-discretionary part added to it. We only had the two, the bad and the good. Now we have, you know, the good, the bad, and the cycles. It's kind of a title for an Italian movie, right? Okay, and now let me see. The two remaining parts of the presentation, maybe I'll just zoom through it to give you the flavor, but of course there's not going to be enough time for a deep analysis. It's, now forget government, take government out again, and just think of the following thing. This is still not capturing all that we wanted for Minsky, because once it goes to the good equilibrium, it just stays there. So there's no effect of stability destabilizing the stuff, because we didn't include the perverse effects of Ponzi financier. So a Ponzi financier is somebody that you add here to the debt equation. So it's someone who is increasing the overall level of debt in the economy, but it's not investing, it's not getting into kappa. It's just buying existing assets. So it's just borrowing for purely speculation. And the dynamics of the Ponzi financier depend on their reaction function, and their reaction function looks at the growth rate in the economy. So when the growth rate is moderately small, this psi is kind of flat. So the Ponzi financier is doing nothing. As soon as the growth rate picks up above a certain significant value, then the psi matters, and then you have an increase in Ponzi financing. That's just the core of the idea. Now you do that in the model, and then you see that this is what happens without Ponzi, goes to the good equilibrium, and this is what happens with the same initial conditions with Ponzi. So there, in a nutshell, is the effect of destabilizing speculation, right? And it was because the economy was doing well around here that the speculation was allowed to enter, and then it sent it to a crash state, okay? So this is what happens again. So this is without Ponzi, it just goes to, you know, growth and everything works. And with Ponzi, it just, that goes to infinity and the economy goes to zero. Now, the last thing I wanted to show is that now we want to say that this Ponzi speculation, which is this P here, it's actually something that adds to the risk in the financial markets, but also adds to the growth aspects that you see in financial markets, because they go in and they buy assets. So for those of you who do financial economics, you know, your KPM or whatever model for asset prices, it's typical to model an index as just this sort of a geometric Brownian motion here. So I start with that, but then I add these two components that necessarily come together because there are no arbitrage opportunities. And absence of arbitrage says that in the equivalent martingale measure, this asset price needs to be a martingale. Now, what are these two components? This is a crash component, so it's a Poisson process, but it's a Poisson process with a variable intensity. So think of a Poisson process like what makes a light bulb fail. So it has a certain intensity which measures the average time that you're going to have for the failure. The higher the intensity, the shorter the time. Now the intensity here is variable, and it depends on the Ponzi term in the economy. So it means that when there's a lot more speculation, the probability of a downward crash in the stock market is higher. And that's intuitively what everybody understands. Everybody is a speculation. This thing is going to break, and you just don't know when it's going to break. But if it was only this downward effect, the whole thing wouldn't be a martingale. There would be a drift down. So to compensate in expectation for this thing to remain a martingale, you need to have a deterministic drift up. And everybody knows that this is exactly how a bubble occurs. It's because there is a higher probability of this thing crashing that there is a positive drift component. So these two terms necessarily go together, and then you just simulate the model. Oh, and then so this is a way in which the real economy and its growth rate affects the speculation, which in turn affects stock prices. But when the stock price crashes, then something else happens, because, no problem. When the stock price crashes, then it becomes more difficult to raise money for real investment, because now all the banks, they pull back on their lending. So there's the interest rate here, which was constant in the previous model. Now it's a combination of two things: a base interest rate, if you like, set by monetary policy or what have you, and something that depends on the level of the stock price in an inverse relationship. There's a negative power. When stock prices go down, this interest rate goes up. This is a risk premium for loans. And now you have a full model, whereas the economy just moving along sometimes gets into a boom period that increases speculation, makes the stock price goes up, then the stock price crashes, and it feeds back on the interest rate that you can use in the real economy. So now that's just a complete scenario. And then you can simulate, and there's several things that can happen. This is a situation where stock prices and debt goes to infinity, and there is no speculation. But you could have both debt and speculation going to infinity, so that's bad. But you could have, everything being finite, and then the stock price is just moving along swimmingly. Which one you are, again, there's no way of knowing, but what you can do is to simulate for a given range of initial conditions, what are the probabilities that you're going to see one scenario or the other. So we do this here, we call it a stability map. So here we graph just employment and debt. Red means that there's a high probability of a crash, and blue is a low probability. So if you start with a high enough debt and low employment, then you have a high probability of crash. If you start with low debt and high employment, then you move the system along, and it's going to be a low probability of crash in whatever time period you chose. Here, I think we did 200 years again. So that's the end. What we can do next is, as Steve said, with the combined model of discretionary and non-discretionary, you can look at austerity versus deficit spending, what the effects are. We want to have inflation explicitly taken into account, because everything here was in real terms, so we need to have separate capital and commodity prices. We want to extend the stochastic model to put, for example, stochastic interest rates, reaction to monetary policy. Instead of just having an index, you can have different market sectors. So now it's a multidimensional geometric Brownian motion that you're doing. And finally, you want to have it in multiple countries, so multiple currencies, exchange rate, because now you don't need to borrow from the financial sector of one country. You can have capital inflows coming from another country. So this adds, it's going to be a little bit bigger system, but it's still, we hope, manageable to be analyzed. And then finally, calibrate everything to data. So I want to leave you with two last thoughts. One is by Robert Solow, who has, by the way, the most fabulous collection of quotes about DSG that I ever seen. You know the one about when Bob Lucas complained that Solow never engages into a technical discussion about DSG. He just dismisses it out of hand, right? And then Solow replied to that observation and says, look, if you meet someone claiming to be Napoleon, the last thing you do is to engage in a technical discussion about the Battle of Austerlitz. If they're so absolutely crazy, you don't indulge them in that. The other one is about the dynamic equilibrium, because economists will model everything as this sequence of shocks that move from one equilibrium to another. So he was giving a talk in the 9th floor of a building, and then he said, look, I can throw a watermelon from the window and describe the entire process as a dynamic equilibrium, but that wouldn't be the most fruitful way, would it? And then in analyzing the Goodwin model itself, he came up with this. It says the truth, and this is actually in the paper, the true test of a simple model is whether it helps us to make sense of the world. Marx was, of course, dead wrong about this. We have changed the world in all ways with mixed results. The point is to interpret.
That's one time I definitely agree with Solow and not Marx.
Right? And the last one is from Schumpeter that says, cycles are not, like tonsils, separable things that might be treated by themselves, but are like the beat of a heart of the essence of the organism that displays them. And I think that's what we are doing in the model. So that's it. Thanks.
You've got an ambitious research agenda.
Yes,
It'll be lots of fun doing all that. Yeah. Just one word, perhaps, of caution. When we go back to the G's and the T's, which Ron was worried about as well, but my point's a little different, the G1 and the T1.
Okay.
Okay, they're all a function of output or income.
Yes.
Okay. So, and the G2 and the T2, they're your discretionary policy.
Yes.
Now, just remember that in the G1 and the T1, you have all the automatic stabilisers working, the inbuilt stabilisers.
True.
Okay? So G is going to go up or down, and T is going to go up or down, depending on what happens to the economy.
That's correct, and
So
that's why.
when you do your empirical work, and when you look at G and T, you have to separate out what was the stimulus, the discretionary stimulus.
Yes, and the stuff that was built in.
From the part that was because of the built-in stabiliser.
No, you're absolutely.
That's not easy to do.
You're absolutely right, and you know, one thing that I presented here as a continuous policy. Maybe what's easier, and it's within the realm of differential equations we can do, are sort of impulse control here. So like so this bear resemblance to a lot of population dynamics and vaccination for epidemiology, where, you know, precisely they want to reduce the spread of an epidemic by vaccinating people. So you can do that continuously, but sometimes that's not the most efficient way. Sometimes you do impulse vaccination. Everybody gets vaccinated in one day, or you know, 60% of the population. So we have the technology to do that, and perhaps that will make the calibration easier, because then you can put everything that goes as policy as usual into those functions, and then you only have to calibrate a discrete an impulse addition to the economy at a precise time. So that might help the econometrics, but you know, we are far from the point where we can actually start testing these things. The goal here is, as you said, follow the research agenda and, you know, throw light into these different variations of the model.
I think the biggest problem is when you try to vaccinate, you know that you can vaccinate each and every person. But in the economy, when there is this automatic stabilizer or doing some monetary policy, fiscal policy, there is no such thing like that. So the total example what you put, actually, that's not applicable in economic.
You know exactly how much you're going to be spending.
No.
Sure you do. Sure you do. You say it's if 1 trillion.
If they knew, then Greek would not be actually gone to that situation. Spain problem will not be that much accelerated. Next is Italy. They know. They don't know anything. That's the biggest problem. What you are assuming?
You know what you inject in. If you make a decision like Rod's, you know, $1,000 per person with a pulse in the country, you measure that, you know the time period is going to go over, you can actually model that as an impulse function.
No, the problem Australia is not actually benchmark. In Australia, there is only 23 million population is there, and the population is a 2% of the world GDP. So in that case, you can't compare with Australia and the rest of the world. So if you see what is happening in Eurozone, don't actually bring Australia into the picture, because Australian situation is completely different. It's completely different.
You can actually, we start with national modelling. You know, there's no DSG model that works at the global level yet. I don't think it will be. But you can model this at the national level, and then you can. The potential is to make each of these a national model that you then link to export-import and financial flows, and actually have a global model that puts us all together in a monetary way.
But let me just say that
we don't know. What you are saying, we know how much you have to spend. My only point is, no, we don't know.
No, I disagree with you. You're confusing two things. We don't know what the effects are because the model could be wrong. It's like in epidemiology, you could say, we think it's this type of virus and has this type of, reproductive constant and so on, and then we do the vaccination and then it's not effective. That part we never know because, it depends on a lot of assumptions in the model. Here also, there could be effects that we are neglecting and are more important and will render the policies ineffective. But I still don't understand what you mean by saying that you don't know how much you're spending. It's exactly like in vaccination. You might not know what the effect is, but you come in.
He's making a very good point, because one of the problems in the US, going back to the stimulus thing, is so-called shovel-ready jobs.
Exactly.
And there weren't that many shovel-ready jobs.
Yeah, well, the government plan. Again, you'll know.
But that's a problem in the model. You're not modeling correctly the effects of the spending. You might have delays. Now you need to make the model more sophisticated with
assumptions. But can I talk one thing about the model?
Yes.
I'm making a comment which may not be very good comment, but I'm telling in a good faith. We never ever can build a model which will be a good model.
That part I understand entirely, and I agree. Yes.
But you can make really bad models models, and that's what DSGE models are. So we're trying to build
No, we cannot make a bad model. If we could make a bad model, then we know what is a good model. We can't make a bad model. We cannot. It's oscillating things, Steve. I'm telling you, it's very much oscillating. That looks like a graph.
Right.
Okay, let's